Hey guys, quick announcement. If you haven't heard, I have a new book releasing on my website on April 15th. This will be book number 5 in my series, with book 6 coming later this year. And to make the world as easy as possible to get into, I'm doing an entire promo campaign too. I have 2 lore videos with incredible original art available to watch like right now, and I'll be releasing more soon, along with a new Instagram page and a new TikTok page where I post art and behind the scenes lore for like 3 days a week for months. Make sure to check all the stuff that I've made for you guys out. I'll put links down in the description below. The sales of these books is what actually funds these videos and all the art I've commissioned. Hope you enjoy. Him was possibly the most disturbing yet interesting villain of my childhood, and I had no idea how to feel about him. He was a man with a goatee, but had a girl's voice and wore heels and a tutu, but also was just the devil. He was a phenomenal villain that mixed feminine, masculine, and mystical. The same could be said for the super famous Frieza or Envy. I didn't know if they were boys or girls. All I did know was that they were super powerful and super fun to watch. But for as widely accepted as these classical villains are, there has been a ridiculous amount of discourse around gender and sexuality in recent fictions. The concern is about shoving gender and sex-based agendas down people's throats, something that's supposedly bad for the viewing experience and society at large. But for it being 2025, it kind of feels like we're back almost 100 years ago. And what I mean by that is the 1930s were a weird time for fiction. The Roaring Twenties were over, the Great Depression was in full swing, and a man with a very particular mustache was spreading a set of ideas that would stay around for a frustratingly long time. But the 1930s was also a time that was massively preoccupied with morality and social contagion. The idea was that simply seeing things and hearing things of an immoral nature would degrade individuals, then society at large. This concern came from the explosion of entertainment media from newfangled doohickeys like the television and radio. And to make sure the content of these wonder machines stayed within the moral bounds of high society, strict limitations were placed on what types of fictions could be transmitted. Speaking specifically for Hollywood, pretty much all major motion picture studios censored themselves with the Motion Picture Production Code, more famously referred to as the Hays Code. This code is responsible for many of the visual choices that have been hallmarks for early television. The avoidance of profanity or illicit drug use, or sexual violence. Other restrictions were a bit more extreme, such as not showing a man and a woman sharing a bed or not showing a toilet. These items were seen as being morally dangerous to susceptible minds. But more than anything else, the Hays Code tamped down on depictions of sexual and gender deviancy. The vast, overwhelming depictions of relationships and gender in Hollywood for decades were straight and cisgendered. Keep in mind, the Hays Code was never a law. The studios chose to do this on their own. It was self-censorship. And even though the studios abolished the code in the 60s, 30 years of moral policing had a lasting effect on people's thoughts of what could successfully, financially, and morally exist in visual storytelling. And this led to the pervasive trope that if sexual or gender deviancy was to be presented in fiction, it had to be portrayed as villainous. And across the 60 years that the Hays Code has been left behind, depictions of queer, trans, and androgynous villains has undergone a vast evolution, both in form and philosophy. So for all of you with strong opinions about how to write and include sexual and gender diversity within fiction, this video is not only going to break down how to properly craft these types of characters, but also explain how we went from excluding queer and androgynous people entirely in the 30s to making them some of our most lauded characters now. Just before we do that though, I do want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Factor. Factor is a product that I'm proud to be able to have on this channel as an endorsement, because honestly it's really good. If you guys haven't noticed or haven't listened to me talk about it in the past, I eat a lot. Like I got up to I think around like 240 pounds while bulking and the entire time I was using Factor. And the reason I think Factor, for me at least, was such a hack is that I'm the type of person that if I don't have something immediately available for me to eat, I am so much more prone to going out and spending a ton of money getting food at like fast food restaurants. And I know for me, if I see delicious meals in my fridge that can be ready in like 2 minutes, that instantly incentivizes me to like stay on course with my diet, to stay on course with my nutrition, and stay at home and not break the bank spending money. Factor is really convenient because every single week you're going to know that there's a delivery coming to your door. It's going to tell you when it is. The app is really easy to use, and you can see all the different types of meals that you can get. And it's not just fully formed meals too. They also have smoothies, snacks, they have breakfast options, pretty much anything that you can think of. And Factor has all different sorts of meals as well. It's not just like the same thing over and over again. It's chicken, it's beef, it's surf and turf, and they even have gourmet meals. So I want to set you up the same way that I got set up. So guys, head on over to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50savage to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50savage at factor75.com to get 50% off plus shipping on your first box too. Honestly, I think it's a great deal, and I hope you guys agree. Now, getting back to what was said before, androgyny among villains has gone through a long evolution. And to help everyone understand, androgyny is the combination of masculine and feminine traits. That's literally what androgyny means. But for a long time, androgyny, along with any sexual and gender identities outside the norm, were considered not only immoral, but were thought of as illnesses. This is why you will have very famous depictions of androgyny or queerness be linked to crime or mental instability. One trope was the creepy cross-dresser. Norman Bates' the 1960s Psycho was a murderer, but possibly the most famous scene in the movie, aside from the shower scene, was Norman being a murderer while wearing women's clothes. This gender fluidity was supposed to be the sinister cherry on top of his psychosis. Another old trope is the depraved homosexual. In Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill is a psychotic kidnapping murderer, but the thing that makes him truly disgusting is his sexual and gender deviancy. He wants to be a woman, so he kills women to make a suit out of their skin. There are many other examples of gender nonconformity being linked to criminality and psychosis, but the reasons behind it are twofold and build off one another synergistically. The first is that, again, sex and gender outside of the norm for a long time were both consciously and subconsciously linked to villainy. People of the 20th century really didn't like queer people, so they represented them in fiction as evil. However, what facilitated this link was the idea that queer people were also alien. Because they had been kept from popular fiction for so long thanks to the Hays Code, people weren't used to seeing queer people in media, and what you are unaccustomed to is often scary and uncomfortable. This is the first trope that I want all of you writers to recognize and be disabused of. Sex and gender nonconformity should not be portrayed as evil. Can villains be queer and still be responsibly written? Of course, but their sex or gender identity should not be the cause of their evilness. No one blamed Jaime Lannister or Ramsay Bolton's straightness when they took advantage of women, so why should we create stories that seek to blame queerness for the evil that exists inside villains? And we can see this in play in our accepted fictions because no one thinks him or Frieza are evil because they are androgynous. They just happen to be androgynous while being evil. But eventually in Hollywood, openly blaming queerness or gender for evilness became less prevalent as social movements sought to humanize these individuals. However, what took the practice's place was something, in my opinion, much more covert and arguably much more damaging. Villains stopped being depicted as explicitly deviant and started to overwhelmingly become depicted as androgynous and effeminate, which gave birth to the sissy villain.
Why, if it isn't my big brother descending from on high to mingle with the commoners?
This is a categorization of almost exclusively male villains that were quietly meant to convey the relationship between evil and unmanly men. The most famous sissy villains appear in animation, especially Disney, and there are plenty of characteristics that act as hallmarks for the archetype. Sissy villains are usually skinny, wispy, flamboyant, emotional, and smooth-voiced. They usually had colored eyelids, shaded lips, and spiked eyelashes to symbolize a face of makeup. Sissy villains didn't want to get their delicate hands dirty themselves, so they had minions to work for them. Sissy villains existed on a spectrum, and some were much more effeminate than others, but all of these traits were meant to convey femininity in men, which is synonymous with unmanliness and a corruption of a proper form. Sissy villains are supposed to represent failed men. Their counterparts, the heroes of the story, would be prototypically masculine or feminine, usually large muscles and strong jaws for men, and a beautiful face and a thin body for women. The entire point of sissy villains was meant to convey that traditional rigid gender expressions of masculinity and femininity were moral and good, while androgyny and sexual and gender divergency, especially among men, was evil and wrong and would fail in the end. Gaston may be Disney's most masculine villain, but he was originally supposed to be a sissy. But that was changed to be a hyper-masculine representation to hit home how Belle was initially rejecting everything that a woman should want. And the reason I say this use of sissy villains is covert and more dangerous is that the villains aren't evil because of their androgyny like previous iterations, but their evil becomes synonymous with androgyny because all other characters are rigidly tied to traditional gender stereotypes. This is the next pitfall that you opinionated writers should avoid when creating your own androgynous characters. If you have an androgynous villain, do not make them the only character with mixed gender characteristics. Have the men in your story have painted nails. Have the women in your story be buff. Show men crying. Show women leading. Demonstrate that while the androgynous character might be evil, varied gender expression is not. But the evolution of androgynous villains does not stop there, and luckily it does get better. See, the entire reason that so many sissy villains were included in animated films was actually for initially positive reasons. Animators felt that since queer characters were kept from fiction for so long, it would be worth it to include them even if the representation was that of villainy. The idea was that simply being able to see different gender expressions on the screen was better than never seeing them at all. Of course, a backlash did come, complaining that real harm was being done by showing the viewing public a consistent message that feminine men were evil. And from there, a new archetype rose to popularity within fiction, the thematic androgynous villain. These are male villains with feminine traits, but those feminine traits are specifically designed for a narrative purpose, and usually one not centered on commenting on gender. Take Prince Charming and Zarbon, for example. These men are very feminine, but their looks were meant to convey that beauty is only skin deep.
Ever hear the old saying that beauty is only skin deep?
Prince Charming was beautiful, but he was a terrible person. Zarbon was obsessed with beauty, but he revealed that his true self was hideous. The androgyny of these men, the way they incorporated femininity into their over-the-top beauty, was meant to convey how a combination of gender expressions could help produce an attractive end result greater than the sum of their parts. But that attractiveness meant nothing if not bolstered by a kind heart. Another thematic androgynous villain sub-archetype is the effeminate fop with a heart of gold. Characters like this include both Pegasus and Professor Crowler from Yu-Gi-Oh!
Did you just call me mister?
No, sorry, I'm new here, Mrs.
I have a PhD in dueling. I've earned the title doctor, thank you.
These are men who are so wealthy and aristocratic that they can avoid the traditional lifestyle and expressions of masculinity.
Wow, a department chair. I had no idea. From how you were dressed, I was thinking you were some kind of weird academy mascot. Like a majorette or a cheerleader.
The age-old idea was that hard work, physical suffering, and sacrifice is what made a true man.
Now you must follow through with the display of violent anger.
But I'm mildly put off at best.
Just throw something.
But Father, I just had my nails buffed for the gala opening.
This is a very puritanical belief that has been long rooted in the West.
Women do all right when they have all the modern conveniences, but us men are better at this rugged type of outdoor cooking. Sort of a throwback to caveman days.
But the effeminate fops were created to show that men had so much money that they could possibly avoid muscle-building labor or labor-centric attire and still be considered men. They loved art and beauty and elegance. They are posh and pampered, flamboyant and delicate, and unmistakably effeminate.
Oh no! I had no idea that you had such powerful cards at your disposal, Kaiba. Hold on, I may have spoken too soon. Yes, here's the perfect card.
But unlike Prince Charming and Zarbon, these characters actually do have good hearts under their luscious exterior. They show that neither feminine affects or wealth are innately immoral when mixed with masculinity. Yet, I think the most famous of the thematic androgynous villains are the ones we introduced at the beginning of this video, the Shapeshifters. These are our heavy hitters like Orochimaru, Frieza, and Envy. These characters actually correct the irresponsible representation of the early sex deviants by doing what they did, but better. What I mean by that is characters like Norman Bates or Buffalo Bill, as we discussed, were written to be gender divergent in order to be considered creepy, weird, and alien by a viewing audience. Their criminality wasn't enough, they had to be depraved as well. And it was this sexual and gender depravity that robbed them of their humanity in the eyes of 20th century audiences so that they could consider them inarguably vile and villainous. The way that the Shapeshifters co-opt androgyny much more responsibly and successfully is because their androgyny on a thematic level reinforces the fact that they are literally inhuman, vile, and villainous. Characters like Orochimaru, Frieza, and Envy are not supposed to be viewed as regular people. They are like monsters whose physical forms are malleable and ever-changing. The fact that we never get a true sense of who they are or what they look like is a core component of what makes them scary and uncomfortable as antagonists. Thematically, Shapeshifters often use their androgyny as a reflection of their physical fluidity and deception, and such characteristics often make them great villains. This idea about alienness and uncomfortability is taken to the extreme when we consider the androgynous eldritch villains. A great example of this is him. The theme is pretty blatant here. He is literally so unknowable, so cosmically evil, that we don't even call him by a real name, only him. And that is why his androgyny works so well. We simply never get a bearing on him, whether it's his gender, his powers, or his ever-changing voice. The same could be said for Hexus of Fern Gully. He's meant to be this primordial force of evil, pollution, and death incarnate, above recognizability or typical gender. To achieve this effect of him being something past humanity's understanding while being humanoid, Hexus was designed to look like a black silhouette, just a cloud of smoke. But note, Hexus's representation is different from characters like Father or Abon. Here, we can see that even though they are just silhouettes, they have very clear, traditionally masculine features incorporated into their designs. Hexus is clearly different though. The design on his face actually is indicative of makeup used for drag, but juxtaposed against that very strong, masculine jaw. And that makes sense when you realize Hexus is voiced by Tim Curry of Rocky Horror Picture Show, who also legendarily played Dr. Frankenfurter. All these examples basically come together to say that androgyny and villainy can coexist remarkably well when used for a thematic exploration of gender expression, physicality, or exaggerated allegorical expressions of the mystic and transformative. This is the third tip for you opinionated writers. If you're going to have an androgynous villain, utilize a concerted theme and a message that takes advantage of the gender nonconformity. But do not pursue a theme that condemns gender nonconformity for simply existing. Because that's what we call pushing an agenda. But if you are thinking that all these guidelines and tips around androgyny and villainy are too complicated, there's another path for you. Just write an androgynous character that isn't evil and that just exists. It's easier than you think. You don't have to justify their gender in the story or make a reason for it. Heck, you don't even have to acknowledge it. They can just be a Hanji or a Harley or an Inosuke. They can simply be. Because believe it or not, queer people and androgynous people and trans people just exist. The Japanese are actually way ahead of us on this. Androgyny, especially among men, has been seen as the height of physical attractiveness going back centuries in the East.
You may have noticed that the men there are drawn quite androgynously, with sharp pointed chins, smooth, rounded jaws, and characteristics we often see on a heavily feminized female face. And this art style is by no coincidence, and it does have a name: Bishinen, meaning pretty boy.
This is why so many ultra-powerful characters in anime are feminized men. Naraku, Griffith, Sephiroth, Muichiro, Illumi, even Aizen got yassified twice. The entire idea is that the combination of masculinity and femininity is how a higher, more powerful being would actually look. Naruto literally had an entire arc capitalized with Haku being lauded as the prodigy among prodigies and how he just liked being androgynous. The controversy around gender and androgyny in modern fiction really isn't that complicated when you get down to it. We have long accepted gender explorative characters in a multitude of fictions. There has been a decades-long practice to normalize them, and it's worked. So if you really have strong opinions on queer and androgynous people existing, either take a look at some of the guidelines presented in this video on how to improve your own writing, or take a long look at yourself. And as a closing note for all my supporters out there, make sure to check out all that new content I mentioned at the beginning that I'm releasing for my books. I have posts here on YouTube breaking down the lore and components of my world, along with a TikTok page and an Instagram page where I post art and videos 3 times a week. Lastly, I have a new book coming out April 15th, available for pre-order now. I'd really appreciate if you guys checked it out. Links for everything below. Thanks for watching all the way into the end. If you like what you heard, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. As always, it was a pleasure, and I'll talk to you all again soon.